Okay, so we have our fourth and final frame, and that's the symbolic frame that's talked about in Bowman and Deal's work. Remember that the symbolic frame, it really roots itself in cultural anthropology. Like organizations and cultures are propelled by rituals, ceremonies, stories, symbol. There's a lot going on. And I think this is especially true in religious organizations, right? Like when we think about the Sunday service and the motions that the community goes through, it is laced with symbol, liturgy, uh, habits, movements. All of that is taking place. Like you're doing more than just receiving information. You are receiving an experience that's laced with meaning and ideas, that is worth paying attention to. So in the symbolic frame, there's certain assumptions that are rooted in this frame. What's most important is not what happens, but what it means. Okay. So it's not just what's said, it's actually how it's said, where it's said, why it's said, how it's framed, right? Have you ever been in a meeting, and I have these a lot, where there's a conversation that's happening here, but you're sensing that there's something under the surface that's the real conversation. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like there's tension in the room, or there's a certain way that a tone is used, or the rolling of the eyes, or there's a reference to something in the past, right? It's in those moments we have to pay attention to the fact that there's sometimes conversations and communication happening here, but there's something underneath that is actually what's actually going on. Okay, so the symbolic frame also says that activity and meaning are loosely coupled, right? Like what we do and what it means are not the same thing. People create symbols to resolve confusion, find direction, and anchor hope and belief, right? So the ways that a speaker speaks, or where the pulpit is, or how we think about the worship setup can have a huge effect on that as well. In the church that I was a part of, our main service was in the round. So the stage was in the center, which made for crazy preaching. That's just another story I'll tell you about. But what was also interesting is that we had the worship team, and they all faced each other in the round. Now, part of that was just pragmatic, right? I mean, they just needed a place to stand, right? If they only faced one direction, 3/4 of the congregation wouldn't see their faces, right? But what was more powerful was that the fact that they all faced each other, and then we all faced each other. The band was not singing to us, and we were responding. We were collectively singing to each other. And there was something deeply powerful about our posture of worship that almost downplayed what is often a critique of worship music, is that it's a performance, right? But we can't really perform if we're all looking at each other. It's just different. And so there was something really, really powerful simply in that symbolism that was going on there. Further events and processes are more important than what's expressed than what is produced, right? For what it's expressed and what is produced, right? So the process matters. And then culture provides basic organizational glue. Like there's something that holds us together, that is deep and profound, that comes from the symbolic place, that's different than maybe what some of the other frames see. So organizations are cultures. They have cultures, or more accurately, they are cultures. And then Sheen says this: a pattern of shared basic assumptions that a group has learned as it solved its problems, and that has worked well to be considered valid and taught to new members. So it's kind of how we do things around here. There's something in the water, there's something in the air. That's why I think we define ourselves as maybe a particular denomination, or a particular background, or a particular, we identify with a particular group, right? There's some basic working assumptions that affect the way that we approach the world, each other, ourselves, how we see God, and all that comes with that. And so that becomes a really, really powerful thing. That's why sometimes when you step into a new church or an organization that you've never been to before, there's this moment where you just are sort of like, I'm not sure what's happening actually going on here. There's things that are familiar, but they're different, right? And I think that's part of the symbolic frame. Now, organizations as cultures, culture is both a product and a process. So it's deeply embedded in the essence of the organization. It embodies accumulated wisdom, right? So there's a narrative that is being told, a story that is unfolding that starts way back before us that we have to pay attention to. And it has to be renewed and recreated as newcomers learn old ways and eventually become teachers. And so leaders who understand culture better are better equipped to understand and influence their organizations. Let me tell you a quick story about this. So when I was a youth pastor at a particular church, I was there for about 7 years. So I had a chance to really develop sort of a culture. Over time, you do that a little bit more, for better or for worse, right? But something dramatic happened that was really, really difficult. And that was my middle school pastor committed suicide. Okay. And he also was molesting boys. So there was just, it was a horrendous situation that our church had to negotiate and everything else. But as I was leaving, a new pastor came in for my youth ministry. And I said to this individual, I just said, you need to understand the story of our youth group. There have been some things quite dramatically that have happened over the years that now those middle schoolers are in high school. And though it happened a while ago, it is embedded literally in the story of our church and this youth group. And you need to understand this as you think about your metaphors, your examples, the way you talk about things, because it's really, really, really traumatic. And for a lot of our students, because they remember these really, really horrific things that happen. Well, what happened, and things got back to me, not that that's always a good idea to talk to the previous pastor, but just, through my interactions and everything else, this particular individual had a habit of, when they talked about the gospel, sort of almost re-articulating Jesus dying on the cross. Okay, now, is Jesus dying on the cross a part of our story? Yeah. But he would kind of overemphasize this and kind of like act like he was dying on the cross, or trying to emphasize the importance of this or whatever. And I'm sure his intent was good. I mean, there's nothing necessarily bad about that. But this idea of dying and tying it with good news requires a slight nuance in this youth group's narrative, because of what these students had experienced. And this made many students quite distraught, because I think there was a misunderstanding of the culture that this new leader was stepping into, and an inability to pay attention to this symbolic frame. So there are stories, narratives, experiences that are hard baked into the narratives of our organizations that have a dramatic effect on people. People react not because what we do is necessarily good or bad. It's just that it's situated in this narrative that is a part of the community that we're a part of. And so there was just an example where this new youth leader had to really reframe some things, because it was really becoming a challenge for them. So symbols reveal and communicate culture. Myths are deeply rooted narratives that try to explain or build cohesion. So there's a story that we tell each other over and over again, which is important. Like, this is how it all began. This is why we're here. This is what this looks like. This is what matters, right? And values are what an organization stands for and cares about. Okay, so I think this is really interesting. I'm going to give you some examples in a second, but I think within this organizational symbols, there's a vision, there are heroes and heroines, there are stories and fairy tales, right? The good stories that convey information about the values or the things that we're about in this church. There are rituals, there are ceremonies. All these things are a part of our organizations, and especially in faith communities, that are important for us to understand as to what they mean and what they convey as we continue to tell the story about ourselves and what we're called to be a part of. Now, let me give you an example of a symbolic frame. So the church that I used to be a part of, Mars Hill, we used our values had motion to them. They were actually arrows. I couldn't draw an arrow on this slide, so I'm sorry about that. But what we talked about is that what we are committed to as an organization is looking backward, because history is important, moving forward because we're constantly in motion and we have to think about innovation. We move inward in the sense that we need to take care of our souls and what's happening in the whole self and the whole person. We look outward, recognizing the fact that there is injustice and pain in the world that we're called to, in Jesus' name, address and bring healing. We look upward as we think about worship, and then we also move withward, where we're not alone, but we're part of a community. So our values were not, and this is really important, very in a symbolic sort of way, they were not static. Like we're moving backward, forward, upward, inward, outward, withward, right? These are things that are in motion. So no matter where we are, the impulse is that we want you to keep moving in these directions and asking yourself consistently, what's your next faithful step? Okay. Now, what orbits these we were thinking about, well, what are the different ways that we use our community, and how do those symbols shape what we do? So the shed is a place of centering. It's the place where we met as a collective group in the round, as I mentioned before, where we tell God's story and we try to figure out our place in it. So that's how we thought about what worship is and what we're trying to do. Adult life was one of our ministries, and that was really about belonging. Like, how do we connect to how do we connect people to the life of the church as adults are learning to make their own decisions, and they're different than youth, right? Mars Hill Kids and Students was about mentoring. How do we advocate for young people by providing spiritual and social capital, right? That's what we're trying to do. Outreach is about serving. How do I help me live beyond myself and others, right? Pastoral development. How do we shepherd others? So how do I train and develop people in our ministry calling? And then this idea of dialogue, of educating. How do we resource each other so that we can hold faith, whatever the topic might be, in a more mature and faithful way? So you can see what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create an ethos where movement is crucial. 6 different ways we move articulates that a little bit more. And everything that we do contributes to people taking a next faithful step in one or more of the directions that they are a part of. This helped us begin to frame the culture that we wanted to have, the way that we thought about topics, the way that we gathered together and how we did things alone, what our different roles were along the way as well. And so this is kind of the way that we began to think about that. I also wrote this a little bit more about, like, well, how do we think about who we are as a community? And this is some of the things that we said that we tried to reemphasize with our community. We would say that we prioritize Jesus as the center of our theology. So Jesus is our center. We encourage dialogue and active participation in faith. So dialogue is our language. Like, that's what we do. We honor each person's journey and support her or his next step. So journey is our norm, right? We're always in motion. We envision a community that includes and membership that participates. So participation is our membership. Like, we're not like, are you a member or not? When we participate, you're a member of the community, and that's what we held up. We invite people to engage in the issues of our day. So solidarity and advocacy with the least of these is our heartbeat. And we view everything as spiritual and sacred. So embodied faith is our method, right? Is our message, right? It's how we actually live. So these are sort of the mantras that we would remind the community of what we're about. There's a lot of things we can agree or disagree with, but we know that Jesus is our center. We know that dialogue is what we do. Like, of course, we're going to have disagreements. That's part of what it's about. We're all in process. You want to be part of this church, then we want to invite you to participate with us in some way that works for you, in ways that that we can do something together. We're advocating for others, and then we are living out the Jesus story through the ways that we live our lives, right? There's just so much that people can get a hold of with that, that distills what we are about. And part of our job in the symbolic frame, and in our case, Mars Hill, was to remind people of who they were and what we were together and what that began to look like. So in the symbolic frame as well, there's organizational theater. So theater plays an internal to internal and external audiences. The way we present ourselves actually communicates some unique messages. And so I think it can be a convincing dramaturgical performance that reassures external constituents, builds confidence, and keeps critics at bay, right? So I think what this means is that in organizational theater, the way that we present ourselves to each other and to the larger world reminds people of who we are and what we're trying to do and what we're trying to accomplish. And so so I think that begins to help us think about, well, why do we do worship services, or why do we meet the way we do? It's not simply just to keep the momentum going. It's a space where we embody and communicate to each other and the wider world what we're all about. It reminds people of who we are and who we are not, and how we actually negotiate that along the way. So, you know, I think as we think about maybe some theater, an example, like why do pastors and youth pastors, when they start new roles, want to change everything? Have you ever noticed that? Maybe you've had that impulse. You start a new ministry and you're like, I'm changing everything. I don't know what that person was doing before, but I'm changing everything. Now, that might be true. It may need to change everything. But we know that oftentimes new leaders step in to change everything because it's symbolic. We're basically saying, hey, the old person's out, I'm in. Doesn't matter what they've done before. We're doing things my way. And I want to start in a place where the things that I have and we're doing are mine, not theirs. Okay. Now, I don't always think that's a great leadership move. Like, there are things that we want to bring forward along the way, and there's going to be disruption with that. But you can almost understand why some people feel like they need to like blow everything up and start over. It actually has to do more with their leadership than actually what the community needs. And then, you know, maybe just think about like this other ones, and I can give you a bunch of examples, but like, why do churches have Youth Sunday? Like, what is that communicating? Like, let's not think about it logistically. Let's not think about it like, well, it's just like we just want to give them time or whatever. Symbolically, what does that mean for the congregation, for the pastoral staff, and for young people? Because it's communicating something of value that may or may not be received, but it's just sort of interesting that we have that along the way. At a very base level, to have Youth Sunday is kind of like saying to everybody, we care about youth, right? Now, do youth actually feel cared about? That's another story, right? We can look at it from a human resource frame, but from a symbolic frame, we can maybe understand why it's done, but we just have to ask ourselves, is that the best way to do it? So organizational theater, institutional organizations are focused sometimes more on appearance than performance. When goals are ambiguous and performance hard to measure, organizations maintain stakeholder support by staging the right play, conforming to audience expectations of how the organization should operate. Meaning, oftentimes we can just try to play the role, even if things aren't going so well, so people just think that we're kind of moving along in that direction. We do that with language. We do that with keeping certain programs going. Like, if we stop that program, that might mean something, right? But if it's not working anymore, why do we keep doing it, right? I find that in evangelical circles, there are certain phrases that people love, and they will respond by saying amen. It's not because they've thought deep and theological about what you're saying. It sounds familiar to them. And so therefore it gives them comfort. And oftentimes the evangelical response or the Christian response is amen, right? Like, you're saying something that I agree with, right? Again, that's not so much informational as it is symbolic, okay? So also there's some other interesting terms. There are meetings that are called like garbage cans, like meetings that track an unpredictable mix of problems, looking for solutions looking for problems, and participants seeking opportunities for self-expression. So sometimes there's just a lot of things happening in a meeting that have nothing to do with the agenda, but people need to say something, speak something, and get it out there. And so I think that that's really, really interesting to think about, of what your meetings mean, not just what you're trying to accomplish. And then there's also just planning. Planning's also our symbol, right? They can become games, they become excuses for interaction, they can become advertisements as well. Like, well, we're not sure what we're going to do, but we're having a meeting about it. You know what I'm talking about? So there's lots of things that go on even with planning that have an impact and can have a symbolic charge more than a pragmatic look. So when we think about these symbolic frames, they also evoke tremendous emotion, right? Feelings, emotions, longings, questions, right? We live in a world of symbol that shapes and touches and moves people in different ways. And so the symbolic frame is very, very powerful. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. We filled out a chart now. We have the symbolic frame. The metaphor of this organization is a carnival or a temple or a theater, right? Like we are all on display. Like we are performing at some level with the symbols and the narratives that we have. The central concept is culture, meaning, metaphor, ceremony, stories, heroes, villains. That's all sort of wrapped up in this. The image of leadership is inspiration. How do I inspire people to the goals that we have? And the leadership challenge here is, how do we create faith, beauty, and meaning? Like, how do we move beyond just the hype or just the symbol to actually the sense of depth along the way as well? So again, I think as we think about our own ministries, especially in youth ministry realms, how are actors supposed to act? What is the narrative in the world that I work in and live in? How do I dress? How am I supposed to talk? What's expected of me? How can you use this frame to help your ministry? What ways might this inspire young people? Are there certain symbols or ways that we can think about things that actually help with this particular frame? What are the frame's limitations, right? If it's all hype, is there no depth? Like, how do we think about that? And then what is expected of youth leaders in this frame? Like, what am I called to point people toward? How do I embody and use a symbol and narrative to continue to help people understand the good news of Jesus and what it means to be together and all that comes with that? So there's lots for us to think about there. I would again ask myself, as you think about this symbolic frame, what symbols or frames do I use in my ministry context? How do they help? How might they be limited? Are there new symbols or frames that might be helpful to you along the way? And maybe another question is, what inspires you? Like, what symbols or narratives sort of drive you? What keeps you up at night or gets you up in the morning? I think sometimes there is this calling that we have that we need for inspiration, even in our own work, that I think can be really, really helpful as we inspire and as we lead people along the way. So I hope that this frame, on top of the other one that I mentioned earlier, give you, again, more looks, more perspectives to think about your own particular context and the context of which you are leading and serving. May it give you language for the work that you do. May it help you find new ways to inspire and help those that you are leading and caring for along the way. And may you know God's grace and peace.